Screen now and check in with Sarah Hashim-Waters.
I'm here with Mark Barabak, political writer for the LA Times. Mark, thanks for joining us. Now, you've been following this campaign. What were some unique highlights of this campaign thus far?
Well, let's start with the nominating process, which Mitt Romney obviously won, but he wasn't running against a real strong field, but he had a pretty tough time winning the nomination. Mitt Romney was someone who Republicans liked toward the end. Some of them were even very enthusiastic about him. But going back to the primary season, he was a candidate that people were okay with. They liked him, but they didn't love him, and he had to struggle to win the nomination, and that hurt him heading into the general election. Just to turn to President Obama for a minute. Presidents who don't have nominating fights tend to get reelected. Those who have nominating fights, Jimmy Carter, the first President Bush, Gerald Ford, tend to lose. That was a luxury that President Obama had. Didn't have a tough nominating fight. That gave him plenty of time to raise money, plenty of time to define Mitt Romney, who had to spend a lot of his time after winning the nomination sort of bringing the base around him, getting Republicans comfortable with him, gathering them around him. And we really didn't see that turn toward the middle, if you will, until the debates. And I'm going to get to the debates in a minute because those were significant. But first we had the conventions. Mitt Romney had a not particularly good convention. I think the takeaway for most people was Clint Eastwood talking to an empty chair. President Obama had a very good convention. He gave an okay speech, a fine speech, but it was Bill Clinton who really blew the roof off the place, really enthused Democrats, and we saw that translated in the polls. You saw more Democratic enthusiasm. You saw President Obama going up in those national polls. Then we get to the debates. And the first one in particular in Denver, October 3rd, which seems like a million years ago now. Not a very good performance by the president. Mitt Romney came in very commanding, very forceful, and started making that move to the middle, appealing to the centrists, appealing to the independent voters he needs to win, would need to win. And so we saw the national polls start to tighten up. You saw Republicans coming home, if you will. The key thing, though, to remember is, as you know, as most viewers know, this is not a national election. It's a race for 270 electoral votes, and that is where President Obama enjoyed advantage throughout the campaign. Didn't have a large lead in a lot of these states, but had enough of a lead that he had more pathways to get to the 270 than Mitt Romney did. It was always going to be uphill for Mitt Romney.
And it's been a very tight race, as you know. Can you provide some context in terms of how sort of deadlocked it's been, and maybe even compare it to Bush-Gore in 2000?
Bush-Gore was sort of unique. Let's hope. No one wants to be doing this for another 6 weeks. I think the more apt comparison may be 2004. There you had a president who was not tremendously popular, hovering right in the 47 to 50% approval range that we've seen President Obama at. You had an economy that at that time wasn't creating any jobs. In fact, President Bush entered that campaign with a net loss of jobs. So very similar dynamic, if you will. And that was a very, very close election throughout. And interestingly, we saw the same sort of dynamic. We saw John Kerry have a very good, very strong debate at his first debate. And I think that one was in Boca Raton. That had him bobbing up the polls the way Mitt Romney did. So to me, the analogy is very much with 2004. Again, not an unpopular, but an incumbent struggling against a lot of headwinds the way President Obama has been, and a very, very close election down to the wire.
And then on the point of undecided voters, at this point, does an undecided voter even exist with all the social media and advertising and television? And
it's kind of hard to believe. Billions of dollars and spending millions of dollars in ads. How can anyone be undecided? But there were some at the end. Not a whole lot. Nationally, maybe 2 to 3%, and I think that's what you saw in some of the polls. You would see, an allocation of some of these folks. Some polls would push leaners one way or another, but you're right. At the end of the day, the candidates were fighting over a very, very narrow slice of the electorate. Maybe a handful of not a handful literally, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% of undecided people in maybe a handful of states. So we really are talking about a national election that narrowed incredibly down just a very small segment of the electorate.
And now on to the weather report with Hurricane Sandy. It was called an October surprise, touted as an October surprise for President Obama. What, positive or negative impacts came as a result of the storm?
Well, it's interesting. There's a mythology that tends to get built up around elections. In 2004, John Kerry was going to win the election until up pops Osama bin Laden with the video over the last week in the campaign, or John McCain was going to win and then Lehman Brothers collapsed. Personally, I don't think if the political scientists go in and really start looking at the numbers, I don't think we're going to say that Sandy was decisive in terms of determining who's going to go to the White House. But it did have an effect on the race. You're right. What it did was, first of all, it put a 2 or 3 day freeze on the race. And it also gave President Obama a chance to step up to the role of commander-in-chief. You know, anytime a president can step off the campaign trail and put on that role, stop being a candidate and start being commander-in-chief, it works to his benefit. And you certainly saw that with President Obama. But it was interesting. We had a story in the LA Times which ran on Sunday, the last weekend of the campaign. And we went out, not the royal we, not just me, but I was in Colorado, and we had about a half dozen other reporters, all of us in battleground states. And we interviewed about more than 60 people. And we only found one person who said that Sandy had changed. And that goes back to your question about undecideds. It was hard to find. I think we found maybe a handful of undecided voters in that whole sample. Unscientific, but still to me very, very telling that there were not a lot of undecided people. A lot of people had already voted. I talked about 15 people in Colorado. All but one had voted already. So I think, yes, Sandy had an impact, but I think at the end of the day, again, I don't think we're going to look back. Even though the mythology may build it up, I don't think we're going to look back and say Sandy decided who's going to be the next president.
So then aside from Sandy, what other alternatives, so to speak, are out there that sort of gave Obama an edge within, national polls?
Well, there was a very good jobs number that came out the last Friday. And I mean, I think to a large extent, as they say, the cake was baked. I think people had sort of already made up their minds. But it didn't hurt that you had a very strong jobs report coming out the last Friday. I think people, stepped back and they looked at President Obama and they saw him working on the Sandy thing. I also think that and I don't want to start getting all technical on you, but I do think what you might have seen in some of the late polls is parts of the president's base, Latino voters, young people, tend to engage late. They tend to start making up their minds maybe the last week, maybe the last weekend of the campaign. And I think some of the polls that showed movement in the president's direction, what that may have been is picking up these sort of late engagers, people who were going to be there for the president, but for cultural reasons, for whatever reasons, they don't engage until late in the campaign. So I think that, even more than Sandy, is going to explain why we saw that little boost. I wouldn't call it a headwind by any stretch. Maybe just a light breeze that the president's back on in the last weekend of the campaign.
And then can you talk about the last blitz that President Obama and Governor Romney had throughout the swing states?
Well, they narrowed the travels down. I think it's significant. Both of them were in Ohio. I mean, you heard over and over, Ohio, this campaign. I mean, it really sort of was the fulcrum of the race. Ohio. No Republicans ever won the White House without carrying Ohio. It was really the president's firewall, if you will. So you saw both candidates in Ohio, and then you saw them basically playing defense. You saw the president in Iowa. You saw him in Wisconsin. You saw him in Ohio. All states that he needed to win, especially Wisconsin, a state that came into play, it seemed, late in the race. Then you saw Mitt Romney in Florida and Virginia, two states, again, that he had to win. There are three virtual must-wins for Mitt Romney, losing any one of them costing him the White House. Florida, he was there on Monday. Ohio, of course, Virginia, and then he ended up in New Hampshire, which is where he started his campaign. But, again, just look at the travels, and there you had sort of the roadmap. Each of them was falling to the White House.
Terrific. Thank you for the great insights, Mark.
Sure.
All right, I've got the latest headlines for you here. Mitt Romney walking away with Utah. Also, Orrin Hatch reelected in Utah. President Obama taking New Hampshire. And so the situation is remaining fluid, but these states are going one to the Republicans, one to the Democrats. Also, we have found out, again, the networks are calling Elizabeth Warren getting a Senate seat in Massachusetts. Tammy Baldwin, the first openly gay senator elected in Wisconsin. That, according to Fox News. We're following the returns as they come in, as can you at latimes.com. Also, you can interact with us, send us your comments, send us your thoughts at latimes.com/askthetimes. We'll delve into the numbers again in just a moment, but first I want to bring in my colleague, Jack Leonard, who is a staff writer here. He's been following some of the state races. Hi, Jack.
Hi, how are you?
Good. All right, let's talk about some of the more contentious of the propositions that are out there. First of all, Proposition 34, which, if it passes, would effectively do away with the death penalty in California.
Yeah, they want to replace the death penalty with life in prison without the possibility of parole for people who are currently on death row. There's about 727 people currently on death row. Yet, since 1978, when the death penalty was last reinstated, there's only been 14 executions. And so supporters of Proposition 34 say it's too costly to keep the death penalty and it's not effective. And there's always the chance of executing an innocent person. Opponents say, yes, they acknowledge that there are a great many problems with the system of execution in California, but say that abolishing the death penalty is not the right way to go, and that reforming the system is what's needed, and they're urging people to vote no.
Do we know how many other states have done away with the death penalty?
I don't know off the top of my head.
All right, but I don't think California is a pioneer in that regard.
No, but it has more people on death row than any other state, and so if California were to do away with the death penalty, it would be a major indicator that perhaps other states would follow suit.
How has Prop 34 been polling?
It started polling, it was certainly behind, but then it had a late surge. But the polls have never shown the proposition with more than 50%, which isn't a good sign. On the other hand, it's sort of neck and neck with the opponents, and it's really going to come down to the undecideds.
All right, let's switch also to Proposition 36. This is another one of the controversial ones because it wouldn't do away with California's three strikes law, but it would rejigger it. How would it do that?
That's right. Well, ever since the three strikes law went into effect in 1994, the most controversial aspect has been this idea that you can be sentenced to prison for 25 years to life for committing a relatively minor felony. Now, all these people have at least 2 serious or violent felonies in their background. But in California, unlike other states, the third strike can be just any felony. That can be petty theft with a prior, so shoplifting, or it can be possession of minor amounts of narcotics. And so you've ended up with these very controversial sentences, very lengthy sentences for people shoplifting, just a pair of welder's gloves from Home Depot, or, incredibly minor amounts of narcotics.
There was the famous case of a guy stealing a piece of pizza and ending up with a life sentence.
Right. Now, it's interesting you'd say that because the opponents of this would point to this case and say, actually, the system works fine because he ended up being released early because he was able to go back to court and ask the judge to change his sentence. And he's actually out, Jerry Dwayne Williams, and he's never gone back.
All right, let's take a quick look also at the LA County DA's race. Who's running and who's ahead?
Okay, well, there's 2 veteran prosecutors from the same office, the DA's office in LA County. The first is Jackie Lacey. She's the number 2. If she wins, she'd be the first woman to hold the office of top prosecutor in LA County. She'd also be the first African American to hold the post. She's running against Alan Jackson, who is a star prosecutor in the office, a star trial attorney. He's probably best known for helping convict music producer Phil Spector of murder. There's some internal polling from months ago. Even back then, the undecideds, a lot of people didn't know who these people were. So it's really unclear who's going to win that race. Although I would say probably most people think that Jackie Lacey is probably the person who's most favored because she has the support of the current incumbent, Steve Cooley.
And I'm not asking our men and women in blue to take sides, but do we know which way law enforcement goes?
Well, that's really interesting because the 2 main unions here, the Police Protective League, which represents LAPD officers, and ALADS, which represents sheriff's deputies, are advocating for Jackie Lacey. But there are plenty of smaller police unions in the county that are pushing for Jackson. So.
All right, staff writer Jack Leonard, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Let's go back to the big screen now and check in with Jim Rainey.
Hey, thanks, David. I'm Jim Rainey. I'm the host of the Politics Now blog. I'm here with Anthony Pesci. He's of our data desk. We're going to take a look at what's going on. In the big state right now, of course, that everyone is watching is Florida. This is a must-win for Mitt Romney, and yet it's neck and neck right now. How close is the vote right now, Anthony?
Very. We're at 84.2% precincts reporting and within a margin of about 30,000 votes, which is very close.
It's inconsequential. And one thing that I'm hearing is that actually Miami-Dade County, which is a county that is going heavily to Obama, the good news for the Obama camp is that he's got a substantial lead there in what? They've only counted what percentage of the vote?
40.
Okay. So it's 40% of the vote, and how big a margin has Obama already built up in Miami?
More than 100,000, 140, 130,000.
Okay, so we can just sort of guesstimate here. If he's already built up a margin of like 130, 140,000, we've only counted less than half the vote. That bodes very well for the president. There aren't a lot of other big counties. I believe Broward County has only counted about 80% of the vote. So next for Mitt Romney, he's got to turn somewhere else. They had talked in recent days about turning to either Pennsylvania or to Wisconsin as sort of out states that were supposed to be Democratic states, but that maybe Mitt Romney could pull out sort of at the last minute here. what's happening in those places.
Well, Pennsylvania has been called for President Obama, and Wisconsin, it's early yet, but...
Right. I believe a few of the networks have called Wisconsin for President Obama. There's something that has been called the Midwestern firewall for the president. He's done very well there, in part because of the auto bailout, in large part because of that, the polls show. So the Midwestern so-called firewall would be Ohio, Wisconsin, and Iowa. And right now, Wisconsin may be tilting, it looks like, or already called for Obama. That leaves 2 states. And I'm hearing that even Karl Rove on Fox News, who's been talking very positively about Romney's chances all night, is now saying that it's sort of a must win in Ohio. Is there any other state, any other combination out there that works for Romney, Anthony?
It's tough. I mean, if you look at our battleground state map, I think the Romney campaign had hoped for Nevada, but with a lot of early returns in, that's looking like it's probably going to go toward Obama. Florida is definitely a must-have, and that's absolutely too close to call. So his chances aren't good if he loses those Midwestern states.
Right. And we've got really Ohio, we've talked about all along as being the key state. It's the one that's gotten the lion's share of the ads. There's been like 1 million ads that have been played through the election season since June. I don't know the exact percentage, but a huge percentage of those have been in the state of Ohio. And so right now, way too early still to call, but I'd say of the 2 camps and all the Twitter feeds and messages we're seeing from the 2 camps, it's looking much better for the president than it is for the challenger.
With almost 30% of the vote in, the President Obama is ahead, but it's a relatively slim margin.
All right, and that's a popular vote nationally?
Ohio.
Oh, in Ohio. Okay. All right, so that's it from the data desk. We're going to go back now to David Lazarus.
Thank you very much, Jim. Okay, we're going to be following the big races as they develop. As you've heard, Pennsylvania has been called for President Obama, making Ohio more of a must-win state for Republican challenger Mitt Romney. Other very close races that we're still watching: Ohio, of course, Virginia, yes, Florida, yes, Colorado, yes. These are really up for grabs states, and we're just not even close to being able to make a call on these yet. It's said that with Pennsylvania going towards the Obama camp, Romney really has to step up in both Ohio and Florida if he really wants to maintain a close watch here. However, it is a very close race, and anybody who tells you otherwise, they're just blowing smoke. And I just want to throw this out there, too, because this is remarkable. Now, this is from the social media front. And of course, Twitter has been lit up all night long. Every time another development has happened, everybody out there sends out their tweets. Well, get this. According to ABC News, as of 6:26 p.m., Twitter hit a new peak of 66,019 tweets per minute. And that's when the Pennsylvania results were announced. 66,000 tweets per minute. That's a whole lot of tweets. We welcome your tweets here at the LA Times. We also welcome your questions, your comments at latimes.com/askthetimes. I'm David Lazarus. Continuing coverage of this election night continues here from the newsroom momentarily.
I'm here with Nick Goldberg, the editorial page editor for the LA Times. Nick, thanks for joining us. So the Los Angeles Times editorial and welcome back to our live continuing coverage of the 2012 election. I'm now joined with Mark Bearbeck, political writer for the LA Times. So, Mark, the AP has just called Maine for Obama. Where do things stand right now? What are you seeing?
Well, what we're seeing is, or are the walls starting to close in on Mitt Romney. I mean, I want to be clear, especially to folks on the West Coast, still a lot of time to vote. Race has not been decided, but right now, Mitt Romney's taken away Indiana. Of all the states that Barack Obama won in 2008, he's taken away one, Indiana. You know, he made a late play at the end of the campaign to broaden the map, if you will, made an effort, even showed up day on election day, showed up in Pennsylvania. They made a play for Minnesota. They were talking about Wisconsin coming into play. Paul Ryan, his running mate's home state. They were even talking about Michigan. All those states now, based on projections, but all those states now look like they are gone. And it's coming down to what we thought it was going to come down to. Virginia, which is very, very close. Florida, which is, again, very close, and North Carolina, and of course, Ohio. Now, you know, of those three, Virginia, Florida, North Carolina, all states that Mitt Romney should have and wanted to lock up by now. They're very, very competitive, and you know, don't want to discourage anyone from voting. Florida, very, very close, as I said. A lot of counties out that are Democratic-leaning counties. If Mitt Romney loses Florida and its 29 electoral votes, really, really hard to see any pathway for him. Other states, Colorado's rolling in. We haven't gotten a whole lot of results from it, but based on what I have seen and the conversations I've had, I happened to be there last week, Colorado looks like it's tipping toward Barack Obama. You know, again, right now, all of the states are breaking Barack Obama's way. And there's just a handful that Mitt Romney is hanging in. And pretty much he has to pick up all of them at this point.
So at this point, what's going on through both of the candidates' heads, you think?
Well, I can tell you, we have reporters at Romney headquarters in Boston, and I was just talking to one of them who described the scene as awake. They have Fox News on, and as these results have come in, particularly the states where Mitt Romney was, again, trying to broaden the playing field. Wisconsin came in, and the mood has just sort of sagged as the night has gone on.
So, Mark, what's it really going to come down to? What do we need to keep an eye out for?
Well, again, if Mitt Romney can't win Florida, then it's pretty much over. The same, I think, could be said for Ohio. One thing we want to watch is the popular vote. Right now, it's very, very close. I would caution folks, there's going to be a lot of talk, and maybe by the end of the night, you could have a case where, and again, I'm not making any predictions or projections, you could have a case where Barack Obama is winning in the electoral vote, where he's effectively been reelected, but he's trailing the popular vote. But an important thing to remember is huge vote to come in from California. I suspect that'll be overwhelmingly for Barack Obama. Some of that may not be counted until tomorrow, so I would caution folks, again, at the end of the night, not making any predictions, but if Barack Obama is reelected, carries a majority in the Electoral College and is trailing in the popular vote, that may not necessarily be the final outcome, because again, there's going to be a big Democratic vote probably coming in from California, from Washington State, from Oregon.
And then on the point of California, on a local level, what's the sentiment like among voters?
Well, I think you're seeing a high turnout here in California. I think long lines. I think a lot of excitement. I mean, it's interesting. California, we have not been a presidential battleground since 1988. This is the last time candidates really came here and spent any time. I mean, Bill Clinton won it in '92. He's locked it away since then. It's become a Democratic stronghold. So insofar as the presidential campaign is concerned, not a whole lot of activity here. The candidates came, but basically to raise money to go spend in Ohio and Florida and those battleground states. That said, there was a lot of money that poured into the ballot measures, and I think you see a lot of people turning out for those today.
Okay, great. Thank you for the update, Mark. We're now going to go to an earlier footage when I spoke with Nick Goldberg of the LA Times. I'm here with Nick Goldberg, the editorial page editor for the LA Times. Nick, thanks for joining us. So the Los Angeles Times editorial board recently endorsed President Obama for the 2012, presidential, can we start this? Sorry. Blip, blip, blip. See, it happens.
We'll do it over and over.
Okay, ready? Wait. Nick?
Sometimes you just blab and you keep going, and then you sound like an idiot.
I was in the middle of a perfectly good point all of a sudden.
Just a touch more. Bring Obama up just a touch.
But we can't keep stopping, especially if we're farther in, so I can't let it happen again.
No, you'll be fine.
On that, or just roll it up.
It's good to get all the blips and mess ups out of the way.
We'll see.
For initially.
Yeah,
So.
it looks like it's too much looking over. Go down a little bit more.
LA Times national correspondent, here talking with Doyle McManus in our Washington bureau. Doyle, as everybody knows, is one of the deans of the American Political Press Corps. Happy to be with you tonight, Doyle.
Robin, it is great to be with you, as
what are you
always.
thinking about the campaign? What are you seeing on the electoral map?
Well, I'm seeing two things. In the presidential race, Mitt Romney is not sewing up the states he needs to sew up. It is too early to call this for Barack Obama, but at this point, Romney ought to be looking at good news from Florida or North Carolina or Virginia, and all of those are too close to call. Now, my guess is that Romney is still going to eke out a win in Florida, but he had hopes to win Florida pretty big. He ought to know about North Carolina now. He doesn't. Virginia looks very, very close, too close to call. So in that sense, Romney's chances are really narrowing down to Ohio and Colorado, and that's not a lot of places to win. His paths, not where he wanted to be at this hour of the evening.
I wanted to ask you about another trend from this evening. And there were a lot of women candidates tonight, both for Senate and Congress, and some notable races, of course. The Democrats, I think, were able to successfully coin the term war on women and use it to great advantage in this campaign. And I wanted to go through some of the races where that issue cropped up. We heard a lot about rape, abortion, legitimate rape, and so on. I wonder, first of all, though, I wanted to ask you about Elizabeth Warren's race in Massachusetts. Tell me what you think came into play there, how she triumphed over Scott Brown to regain Ted Kennedy's seat.
Well, that is a remarkable race because Elizabeth Warren looked as if she was behind for much of the race. She caught up in part because of terrific performances, and I think they had 3 debates. They talked about having a 4th, but Scott Brown said, well, he couldn't do the 4th because he was too busy. That was a sign that he wasn't doing all that well in those debates. Remember, Massachusetts is a Democratic state. It was always going to go for Barack Obama, even though Mitt Romney was the governor there and lives there. Massachusetts voters should have preferred Elizabeth Warren all along, but Scott Brown kept painting her as a Harvard professor who made too much money from her law practice and who claimed to be a Cherokee Indian. Well, eventually she just outlasted him, and Democratic voters came home.
Now, how about the Missouri Senate race between Claire McCaskill, the incumbent, and Todd Akin, who got into so much hot water when he made comments about forcible rape and abortion and a woman who was raped not being able to conceive because the woman's body knows the difference? How do you think that played out in Claire McCaskill winning that seat tonight?
Well, initially the bottom dropped out of Todd Akin's support. Then he and a lot of national Republicans tried to get him to drop out of that race so they could put someone else in his place. It turned out they were right and he was wrong. He clawed his way back probably to about half of the votes that had left him over that controversy, but only half. It looks as if Claire McCaskill is going to win quite a decisive victory, and that really is a surprise because that is, at the beginning of this year, a seat that Republicans really thought they could count on winning. And there was, of course, one other race, oddly enough, in which the question of rape played an important part, and that was the Indiana Senate race, where Richard Murdoch, the Tea Party candidate, talked about said that the reason he did not favor allowing abortion in the case of rape was that a pregnancy caused by rape, he said, was God's will.
That's right.
Well, there's a theological debate there, but it's just plain bad politics, and that at that point the bottom dropped out of Murdoch's support.
Joe Walsh won. And it's interesting because having covered the subject of abortion for quite a long time, he was not expressing, as I saw it, anything that's very unusual in the anti-abortion community. What's interesting is that those views broke out into the open, and voters were able to take a look at what that meant, particularly women, for themselves. There's also another race. It's the race between Joe Walsh and Tammy Duckworth in Illinois. She, of course, is the Army helicopter pilot who lost both legs in combat. And he, of course, had made comments about how she talked too much about her military service. What do you think happened in that race? She prevailed, of course.
Well, yeah, he was just plain a bad candidate, dyspeptic, angry, dismissive, and again, she outlasted him. There is a broad lesson here for the Republican Party, and that is that even if you think you have the wind at your back ideologically, you've got to be careful who you nominate. That the voters want a candidate that they're going to like. I'm going to mention another candidate, another female candidate, Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, who's probably not going to win her race for the Senate, but she's going to come awfully darn close, and that's because folks in North Dakota just plain like her. North Dakota is going to go 20% for Mitt Romney, but that you're going to see a whole lot of ticket splitters, and that one is going to be very, very close.
Now, bringing it back to the presidential campaign, what do you think President Obama had to do in terms of the women's vote this time around? And does it appear, at least so far, that he was able to get it done? And what do you think, why did Mitt Romney have trouble with some women, particularly single women?
Well, there has been that gap. There are two gender gaps in a sense, if you like. There's the classic gender gap in which men disproportionately vote Republican and women disproportionately vote Democratic, but there's also a marriage gap. Married women are probably going to go narrowly for Romney, unmarried women in a landslide for Obama. A lot of that does come down to these issues of attitude, really, about abortion and contraception. And it is quite remarkable that there were a couple of weeks there in the late summer where if you had listened to the debate in this presidential campaign, you might have thought that the economy wasn't the number one issue at all. The economy, of course, was the number one issue, had been the issue for months and months and months, but the Obama campaign tried very determinedly to turn this into a debate about women's health issues.
Yes, and they were able to do that successfully, I think.
They sure did, and they did it especially with young women.
Right.
That was that was an immense amount of the Obama campaign pitch on college campuses to young men as well, who actually care
That's
about
right.
women's
We had
health.
a lot of women saying, what is this, the 1950s? We thought we had settled these issues about contraception and insurance coverage for contraception, and suddenly it was back in the news, and everybody did feel like it was a little bit of a time warp, I think. So we'll be biting our nails in the next hour or two until the polls close, waiting to see what happens with those states that everybody's on edge to see. I know you're not in the business of making predictions, but how do you think they're feeling right now at Romney headquarters?
Actually, we know how they're feeling at Romney headquarters, and we know how they're feeling at Obama headquarters, because there are both LA Times reporters there on the ground, and there are television reporters there. And all I can say is that every interview I have seen coming out of Obama headquarters has had pretty big smiles. And at this point, the Romney folks are biting their fingernails because they have to get very lucky and very good in the next few hours if Mitt Romney is still to stand
That's
a chance
right.
of winning that
All right,
presidential
Doyle,
race.
thanks so much for talking to us tonight. That's Doyle McManus from our Washington Bureau. And now we're going to throw it back over to Sarah.
Great, thank you, Robin. I have a bit of an update. Mitt Romney is projected to carry Arizona, according to CBS News and NBC News. And an AP race call, Romney has won all 5 electoral votes in Nebraska. President Obama, on the other hand, is the projected winner in New Mexico, according to ABC News, as well as Fox News. And again, as Robin mentioned while she was talking to Doyle, Senator Claire McCaskill has defeated Representative Todd Akin to retain her Senate seat in Missouri, according to CBS and NBC News. Twitter has officially announced with 20 million tweets, Election Day has just become the most tweeted about event in U.S. political history. So what exactly are people tweeting? What's on their minds? What are they talking about? One of the trends is hashtag I'm sick of, as in I'm sick of this election, which all right, let's see who's feeling that way. We got @MaxPlayDirty, who tweeted hashtag I'm sick of hearing about this election and the debate. So happy it's all over after tonight. Try reporting on it live, Max. And next up, we've got the hashtag Stay in Line. Nicole M, who uses the Twitter handle @AsTold by Nicole M, tweeted hashtag Stay in Line. Exercise your rights as a U.S. citizen and vote. Very nicely put. Meanwhile, Aaron Fox, who uses the Twitter handle @eFoxy, that's with 3 Ys, tweeted hashtag Stay in Line and get your vote in. Remember, your vote is like a grain of sand in a vast beach. You need each grain to get the big picture. And we are just about ready to take another break, guys. Be sure to weigh in on Twitter using the hashtag VoteCA and continue giving us your suggestions, comments, questions on latimes.com/askthetimes. We'll be back in about 10 minutes. I'll see you then.
Welcome back to live coverage of election night, where we're bringing the full resources of the largest newsroom in the West to basically to your fingertips as we cover every last race that's out there in real time. You're welcome to play along at home by going to latimes.com, where you can go to all our interactive maps. You can see all the state-by-state, county-by-county returns as they come in, again, in real time. We also welcome your thoughts. Yep, everyone's a pundit in the age of social media, and all you've got to do is go to latimes.com/askthetimes, and you can get to us. We welcome what you have to say. There's also a lot of tweeting going on. We'll get to that in just a little moment. Let me go back to my friend Ben Welsh here, who is our database guru. All right, we got some news, but first let's look at California. The polls are closed.
You ready? Okay. In 5, 4, 3.
Holy Toledo, we got blindsided by internet gremlins galore right there. Okay, we got knocked off the air, but we are back. I am David Lazarus. This is continuing election coverage from the LA Times newsroom. My buddy Ben Welsh right here. He's our database guru. And while you were away, we had news. Let's skip the California map. Let's get right to the big map. Look at what's going on here. Walk us through it, Ben.
Right, so the state of California, which polls closed just several minutes ago at 8 o'clock, has already been projected to be a win for President Barack Obama.
Not a big surprise?
Not a big surprise, but a very big prize for President Obama. California has the most electors of any state in the country, 55, which adds to his overall total, bringing him into the Electoral College lead, with 225 votes to Mitt Romney's 186.
And remember, it takes 270 to win the big seat. So at 225, President Obama's probably feeling like he's at least rounding the last curve.
That's right. But the home stretch really is still the battleground states that we've all been told to watch for months and are really turning out to be the main attraction tonight. That includes states like Florida, where right now with 94% of precincts reporting, Barack Obama is holding a very, very narrow lead of about 36,000 votes over Governor Mitt Romney.
Were we expecting the lead to be even slimmer in Florida, considering what happened in 2000?
Well, to be closer than 2,000 is very difficult when the election was decided by only a couple hundred votes. But all polling has shown, that it's been a very close race with results coming in at 1 or 2 percentage points for either candidate in different polls.
God, a recount is actually possible, isn't it?
Yes, and I believe there is. It could happen not just in Florida, but maybe in another state like Ohio, which we're also seeing there's not quite as many votes in. 67% of precincts are reporting in Ohio. And there, again, President Barack Obama clings to a narrow lead over Governor Romney.
Now, Ohio is the must-win state for everybody. Is that right?
There is a path to the presidency for both candidates that excludes Ohio, but it's very difficult, and it includes Florida. So if you lose both Florida and Ohio, it's very difficult for you to win. But if you win one or the other, there is a road. For instance, if Governor Romney were to win Florida, Virginia, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Colorado, he could win the presidency without Ohio. But that is probably a more difficult road, really.
Do we know what the odds are? For instance, Colorado, that was kind of a coin toss for a long time.
Colorado was a 50-50 state in most of the polling, and it was one of the few states where in early voting the Republicans held the advantage over the Democrats. But so far, with 30% of precincts reporting, President Obama is also clinging to a narrow lead there.
Do we know about Hawaii?
Well, there's no results yet appearing on this map, but I've been told by our producer, Patrick Day, that it has been called by the Associated Press for President Obama. And seeing as it's his home state, it's no surprise.
No, not a big surprise. I want to throw out there, Ben, that it seems as though there haven't been any major incidents so far in terms of all the voting. In one Florida county, voters were wrongly told they could vote the day after the election. They can't. In Storm Rack, New Jersey, emergency plans to allow email voting proved too popular for election officials to handle. That was a little rough one. They're going to have to dig out of that. And in Pennsylvania and Ohio, there were a number of problems raised, questions about the integrity of the vote. It looks like there could be some legal questions in these states as well.
That's right. And if we end up with a very close election in any one of these states that proves crucial, those legal battles could carry on well past Election Day.
You know, analysts were saying earlier that if we did face a recount or if we did face any sort of contested outcome, it's going to be very bad for the stock market. The stock market does not like uncertainty, and any sort of recount or prolongation of this process would take stocks down and potentially take the economy down with it. I spoke earlier with Walter Hamilton, one of our star business reporters, about Wall Street's feelings about the candidates and the election. Here's what he said. The business world tends to be a bit conservative in its political leanings and in its financial contributions. Let's talk a bit now about how the business world got on with President Obama and what, if any, expectations it might have for a Romney presidency. To help us do that, we are joined by Walter Hamilton. He's a financial reporter here at the paper. Hi, Walter.
Hello, David.
All right, so when President Obama came in 4 years ago, I think the business world to some extent was caught up in the whole hope and change thing. Then what happened?
Well, the business world, especially Wall Street, was actually an Obama supporter against John McCain 4 years ago. Part of that was the hope and change thing. Part of it was they saw how bad the economy was. Obama wanted to bail them out, et cetera. With campaign contributions, they gave the bulk of their money to Obama, which actually was a break from the past. Historically, Wall Street, very Republican, very conservative, had given its money to Republican candidates. They supported Obama. They bought the whole hope and change thing. That's changed this time around. You call Wall Street bankers fat cats, as Obama did in a famous Oval Office meeting in 2009. That's going to tend to annoy Wall Street. So this year, 3 out of every $4 that Wall Street, meaning big investment banks, et cetera, have given in the presidential campaign, that's gone to Mr. Romney.
Now, we've seen in the last 4 years some fairly extensive overhauls of rules. For example, the Dodd-Frank rule. These are extensive financial regulations. We also saw healthcare reform, which a lot of businesses kind of liked. How did all of this color the business world's perception of Obama?
A good question. Really what happened, and especially this is the financial world broadly, did not like a lot of the reforms that he put in, obviously. Wall Street, even though many people say Wall Street caused the global financial crisis that struck in 2008, they did not like the Dodd-Frank rule, which was a broad rewrite. They don't like another thing called the Volcker rule, named after Paul Volcker, the former Fed chairman. But more than that even, is that, again, with the fat cat comment and a few others, Wall Street, which has really been revered by U.S. presidents, I mean, a number of Goldman Sachs CEOs have gone and held high-level government positions, were insulted. They just had their feelings hurt. And that, almost more than anything else, is going to explain why, especially Wall Street, did not like President Obama.
But Wall Street doesn't like uncertainty. We know that because the stock market gets all higgledy-piggledy, to use the technical term, every time we have uncertainty. Romney ran as the business candidate. He said, my business background is what makes me qualified for this job, but didn't give a lot of specifics. How did the business world interpret that?
I think what's happening is you have a lot of businesses that, even though he didn't give a lot of specifics, think he's going to be pro-business, he's going to be anti-regulation, he's not going to raise our individual taxes. Many of us obviously are wealthy CEOs, et cetera. He's not going to raise our taxes. He's going to take a lot of steps, both direct and indirect, both explicit and tacit, to lighten the load on us personally, financially, in terms of our businesses, et cetera. Many businesses like him for that reason. There is a subset, especially Democratic-leaning business executives, who fear that he will screw around with the Federal Reserve. A lot of people say, as much as we don't like the Federal Reserve's policies, et cetera, it has helped keep the economy afloat. And if Romney were to come in with a very activist approach toward overseeing the Federal Reserve, which has obviously historically been very objective and out of the political fire, that does alarm some people.
The lion's share of campaign spending from the business world, where'd it go?
It went about 60% of it from the business world as a whole went to Romney over Obama, and about 75% of it, if you're just looking at Wall Street and the financial community, went to Romney, who's obviously one of their own, over President Obama.
Walter Hamilton is a financial reporter here at the LA Times. Walter, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, David.
Go.
We're back into it live from the LA Times newsroom, bringing you up-to-the-minute election returns. I'm David Lazarus. I've got Jim Rainey, one of our star political writers here. Big news. Looks like some of the networks are calling Ohio for President Obama. And if that's the case, that could be the whole ball of wax.
Yeah. As we've known all along, Ohio is a key state. Romney got in a very difficult situation here where he really had to sort of win out in all of these close states. All night long, we've had states like Wisconsin, that he thought he had hope in, a little bit of hope in Pennsylvania, go to Obama. The last state that everyone, including some of his supporters on Fox News, Karl Rove, was saying he may be able to win in Ohio and hold on, but it looks like now that may have slipped away. So that sounds like that could be the election.
And meanwhile, we've also had calls, President Obama taking New Mexico, Mitt Romney taking Missouri. Looks like Iowa fell into the Democratic camp. And so when you start looking at the map, Jim, we're looking at, again, Virginia, we're looking at Florida. These aren't just must-wins. These are must-wins now for Mitt Romney if he wants to keep his head above water.
Well, if Ohio's gone, I'd say the water's already gone up over his eyeballs and he's done. What you had was, these were three key states for Obama. You had Iowa, Wisconsin, and Ohio. That was sort of known as the Midwestern firewall. That was the three states that he was suspected he did have a good chance of winning because of the auto bailout and other reasons. And the Obama folks really felt, even if they had problems in places like Florida and Virginia, that if they won those three states, that gave them the total they needed in the Electoral College. And they still may win in Florida, Oregon, some of these other states that we haven't called yet. So it's looking very good for President Obama.
If you're just joining us, it looks like some of the networks are calling Ohio one of the key battleground states, if not the key battleground state for President Obama. And if that's the case, as you've been hearing from Jim Rainey, it looks like President Obama would walk away with the entire presidential election. I guess one question, if we don't mind speculating a little bit, and that is, if President Obama does take Ohio, then it becomes a question of mandate.
Right.
The more he can pile on the electoral votes, the more he can say, this country is behind me, this country is behind my plan, and therefore Republicans need to stop being such sticks in the mud, as he might have said before, and start working with me.
Right, absolutely. And in fact, we've already seen tonight, there's a lot of commentary on Fox News already as this has been slipping away about, well, how's he going to get anything done? Is he, President Obama, going to be more willing to compromise? And some of the commentators on the other side have been saying, well, hey, wait a second. It's actually some of the results in the Senate races are showing that the sort of Tea Party leaning Republicans are having some trouble. And so they're saying, it's not just the president who's got to give. There's clearly going to be a huge fight over this fiscal cliff. And, we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. We could take a look at Florida, too. One very interesting thing that's happening in Florida is that Gary Johnson, third-party candidate, the Libertarian, is actually drawing enough votes in Florida, about 41,000 votes.
From whom?
That he's probably pulling those votes from Mitt Romney. I mean, he's a Libertarian on many issues. He agrees with Mitt Romney. So Gary Johnson is someone who's been talked very little about throughout this race. All of a sudden, he's got 41,000 votes. If you put those into the Romney column, Romney would still be competitive in Florida. Certainly, Obama would like to win Florida for just the reason you talked about. He wants to be able to go to Congress and say, look, I do have a mandate here. You've got to follow my lead at least a little bit on some of these issues, starting with the fiscal meltdown that we're facing in Congress.
And what we've been expecting going into this is that the Democrats would maintain control of the Senate, Republicans would take control of the House, and now it looks like if President Obama is indeed reelected, which is increasingly looking clear, actually, it's just been called. Ohio has gone with President Obama. And as you've been hearing Jim and myself talking about, once Ohio goes to President Obama, which is the case, it becomes virtually impossible.
Impossible. We could go ahead and say impossible.
Okay, it becomes impossible for Mitt Romney to find a way. And so we are now calling the race for President Barack Obama, re-elected President of the United States for the next 4 years, presuming there's no legal challenge or other such things that could happen that could hold things up. It looks like that's it right there. The president has taken the entire race.
Yeah. Well, and I think people, thought this was the expectation. If you looked at the polls in the last few days in the states that we're talking about, Obama had taken not a huge lead, but what seemed to be a pretty clear lead. Everyone had said in the last week or so, all the respected pollsters said the path, as they say, was very narrow for Mitt Romney. So not a huge surprise. Now President Obama does have a big burden, though. He's got to try and govern, in a very divided country, with a very divided Congress, and it's going to be a big challenge for him to try and make things happen. And we start out with this issue of the so-called fiscal cliff, where there are going to be mandatory cuts in defense and in other parts of the national budget unless we can come up with a compromise to either raise taxes or cut elsewhere. And there's a lot of disagreement on that.
All right, if you're just joining us, AP has called Ohio for President Barack Obama, which means effectively he has won the contest and won 4 more years in office. I'm speaking with Jim Rainey, our political reporter, about how that's going to play out. And clearly there are a number of issues now that the president is going to have to step up and tell the Republican-dominated House. So we haven't really changed the dynamic in Washington at all, but he has to be able to say, all right, first of all, you guys who are against Obamacare, straight down the line. It's done. It's done. The law of the land. No one's going to repeal it. So now it's time to move on, improve upon it if you can. But that's that. As you say, the fiscal cliff is a pressing concern. But more interesting, I think, is the so-called grand bargain. And that was something that the president and the head of the House, John Boehner, tried to accomplish. Something that would bring down the deficit, bring down national debt, reform the tax system, and also address entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. It looks like President Obama would be in a much better position to actually call John Boehner back to the table and say, let's do it.
Well, you would think a lot of the voters would now say, let's do it. Let's have some sort of compromise. John Boehner famously was ready to go for some revenue, as they say, some tax increases. Of course, the Tea Party forces in the Republican Party in the House said, no way, no revenue increases whatsoever. And Eric Cantor, who's the Republican whip in the House, there's a lot of pressure from the right, led by Cantor, led by Paul Ryan, interestingly.
Who was reelected tonight, it's worth pointing out.
Yeah, Paul Ryan of Wisconsin, the vice presidential pick for the Republicans, to not have any revenue, not have any tax increases at all. Obama tried to cut this deal. Apparently, it was widely reported, was well down the road with John Boehner, the speaker, to get that deal done. They just couldn't make it happen. So another thing, just to raise another point that is historic, at least for the last 70 or so years, first president to be elected with unemployment over 7% since Franklin D. Roosevelt. So we've had George H.W. Bush, we had Gerald Ford, we had Jimmy Carter, and I think that's all of them, who were all presidents who could not be reelected because unemployment was so high, people were not feeling good about the economy, and all went down to defeat. The Republicans sort of thought that was their ace in the hole. They talked about jobs incessantly, as you would expect them to. You can't blame them. That was the number one issue in voters' minds. It didn't work out for them. And I think a big part of it was that you still have to have an alternative.
All right, but let's look at the jobs thing for a second now. The Republicans ran on the economy. Or at least they wanted to run the economy. They ran on jobs. Mitt Romney stepping up and saying, I've got a plan that would create 12 million jobs. Don't know how he was going to do it, but that was his plan. And yet the American public, at least a majority of them, said, we don't buy it. And even though Mitt Romney repeatedly said, you're not better off than you were 4 years ago. Things are tough. The American people seem to say, well, yeah, but we're not going to change horses. Is that because the Republicans were unable to put out a specific plan as to what they were going to do?
Well, I think it might partly be a specific plan, or that people didn't buy this 12-point plan, 5-point. How many points was
5-point plan with 12 million jobs?
12 million jobs. Thank you. I should know that by now. No, I think more what it was is they just didn't really like Mitt Romney. They decided, and you know, I think Mitt Romney left some things on the table that if I'd been running his campaign, I wouldn't have. I think his faith, his Mormon beliefs, his dedication to his church was sort of one of the things that animates Mitt Romney the most. For some reason, I think we know why. He was scared of losing the evangelical vote. He did not talk a lot about that. I think
and yet, most people who say they know Mitt Romney say that the best-selling faith, and that he is in fact a very decent man, and that he might have squandered a very strong opportunity by not playing up that fact.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the things that happened at the Republican convention when we were there is we had the infamous Clint Eastwood moment. Clint Eastwood came up and sort of rambled, and some people liked it in the Republican base. They thought, here's Clint Eastwood being, you know, tough on the president. But the fact is that same night you had 3 families get up and talk about their experiences with Mitt Romney in the Mormon church, him coming and caring for them in their times of greatest need. And it was tremendously moving to everyone in the arena. And unfortunately, for Mitt Romney, unfortunately, folks at home didn't see that. So I think that was a much bigger problem for Mitt Romney than really the specifics of his plan. He then had the 47% comment where he seemed to belittle a large portion of the American population, saying they were lazy. In effect, they were dependent on government. And I think those were his bigger problems, that he just didn't make that connection. Republicans wanted it to be a referendum on Obama, up or down, but it's always a choice. It's not a referendum, it's a choice. People looked at President Obama, decided things are maybe ticking up a little bit, we're going to give him another chance.
All right, Jim Rainey, thank you very much for joining us. Your thoughts are also very welcome at latimes.com/askthetimes. For more now, let's go to the desk with Sarah Hashimwadis.
All right, thank you, David and Jim. I'm here with Jack Leonard, who's here to update us on mail-in ballots. What have you got?
Well, looking at the criminal justice propositions, so far we see the 3 strikes amendment. That is winning big, which sort of coincides with what the polls had been saying. So it's no surprise there. The death penalty, it doesn't look like California is going to end the death penalty if the mail-in ballots are any indication. However, mail-in ballots tend to skew, at least they traditionally have, tend to skew conservative. So perhaps the Proposition 34 will do better as the votes that were cast today come in. Human trafficking, I guess this is not a huge surprise, but it is doing really well. So people apparently don't want human trafficking and want increased sentences for human traffickers.
Right. And then what about some of the other props?
If we look here at the early mail-in count, we've got Proposition 30 is 56.7% against Proposition 30. Like I said, though, this may well change. We've got only a fraction of the votes in so far, but there's more against Proposition 30 than for it. 32 is also winning. It's 54.1% to 45.9%. And the genetically engineered food labeling, this is also going down as far as the mail-in ballots are concerned so far.
I was going to say, on the point of, when you were talking about human trafficking, are there any surprises really that you found out? No, not just with human trafficking, but with any of the propositions.
I suppose 30, it doesn't look very close with the mail-in ballots so far that have come in, but again, that's, we're in early days, so that could really change. Sure. You'd expect it to be closer than it is now, at least the polling was much closer. Certainly that's also true of the death penalty. Proposition 34, which would remove the death penalty and replace it with life in prison without parole. That was sort of neck and neck in the polls with opponents. But there was a large undecided vote, and so what we've been waiting for is to determine, how those undecideds were going to vote. This may not be the best indication, the early mail-in ballot, so maybe we probably need a lot more in the next couple of hours.
We'll continue to wait and see. The DA's race, can we have an update on that?
Yes, it looks like Jackie Lacey has taken a pretty decent lead early on from the mail-in ballots. This is the first wave of mail-in ballots. We'll get another in about half an hour. But she's got about 56% of the vote versus 44% for Alan Jackson. I spoke to Alan Jackson's campaign strategist who said that their strategy has been focused on TV ads in the last few weeks, and that might well more likely to influence people who are going to the polls today than people who voted weeks ago by absentee ballot.
And then any other interesting updates as, the AP is calling the election, all that sort of stuff. So what's going on now? Anything else you want to update us on?
Well, as far as California, it's still too early to call anything because the polls really have only just closed. So I'm sure we'll have something in the next hour or so.
Great. Thank you, Jack. And now we're going to throw it to David at the screen.
Thanks a whole lot, Sarah. If you are just joining us, huge news. President Obama re-elected to another 4-year term. That after he walked off with Ohio, the battleground state, the tutti battleground states. There are a bunch of them tonight, but that was the big prize, and it has been called for President Obama. In fact, he sent out a tweet earlier saying, "We're all in this together. That's how we campaign, and that's who we are." Thank you. And I expect that that's going to be reflective of the tone that he's going to strike in his speech when he accepts the fact that he is going to remain as president, and that is, it was a tough fight. We are going through tough times. We are not out of the woods, and he's going to probably not take a victory lap per se, but essentially sound the note that there is much work still to be done, which has been essentially the hallmark of his campaign. We're on the right track, he's been saying, but we're not there yet. We're not out of the woods. And I expect he's going to sound that theme throughout. You can see on the map here, Ohio finally called for President Obama right here. Colorado's still up for grabs over here. That's one of the ones we've been watching. Seems to be leaning a bit towards Obama, but we're not sure about that yet. Florida, being Florida, still not decided, and that's going to be up in the air for a bit. Florida is going to be one of the big talking points for the president as far as his reelection goes in terms of a mandate. If he's able to get Florida as well, along with Ohio, along with Virginia, along with Colorado, say, then the president is in a very good position to step up to what will still be a Republican-controlled House of Representatives, and he's going to say it's time for us to work together. CNN is projecting that the Democrats will retain control of the Senate, which means, in effect, that the president is not going to be able to push through all legislation he wants because he has to still get the House aboard, but the Democrats in the Senate will be able to be a roadblock, as they were to anything that the Republicans might bring forward from the House. We also have a note here that Dems have won as governor in the gubernatorial races in West Virginia and Missouri. President Obama has also taken Oregon, so you can see right down here along the west, as expected, all falling into the blue column, and that's going to help the president make his case for 4 more years going forward. We were talking earlier with Jim Rainey about some of the challenges that the president is facing. Obamacare, apparently not going to be one of them. Mitt Romney had said that on his first day in office, he would start dismantling Obamacare. That's the health care reform law that has so many important changes coming down the pike. Well, that's not going to happen. And no matter how many times House Republicans make a run at it, well, it'll fall apart in the democratically controlled Senate and go nowhere. So now we're going to be looking at the fiscal cliff, for one thing. That's tax hikes and spending cuts that are going to come at the end of this year. And we're also going to be looking at some sort of grand bargain whereby the president and Republicans will come together and talk about how can we bring down deficits, how can we bring down the national debt, how can we reform our tax system, that's a big one, and also how can we finally address entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. And we're looking at some big deficits there on both counts. In fact, over the next 75 years, Social Security expected to run a $3 trillion shortfall over the next 75 years. Medicare, and this is the big one, a $30 trillion shortfall. So any attempt to tackle entitlements, Social Security is the easy one. That's the low-hanging fruit. Medicare is the tough one. The health care reform law gets us part of the way there, but not nearly all of the way there. And most prognosticators say what we're going to be looking at inevitably is probably cuts in benefits, which could mean perhaps an increase in the age with which you would qualify, and also higher taxes to cover this. All of that is going to be coming. The president, and as you can see here with all the blue starting to speckle in and essentially laying down the groundwork for his next 4 years, the president is going to say, I've got the American people solidly behind me now, and they want this. They want my agenda. They want the hope and change that he promised 4 years ago that the Republicans said he was never able to deliver. Well, now he's going to have another 4 years to make good on his earlier promises. All right, well, let's talk about the stock market now and how that's going to play out. I spoke earlier with Walter Hamilton, who's our stock market reporter, and we talked a little bit about how things are going to play out in the event of an Obama win. Here's what he said. And now we know we have 4 more years of the Obama administration. How is that going to play out in the business world? How is that going to play out in the economy? We're joined by financial reporter Walter Hamilton. Hi, Walter.
Hi, David.
All right, so put on your Wizards cap for a moment and kind of prognosticate what happens now over the next 4 years.
Well, I think you're going to see a lot more of the same. I guess the good news for the business community is that they already know what they're getting. You have a proven entity. You know, the president and his policies have been in place for 4 more years. I don't think you're going to see him veering dramatically. So, you know, for example, Obamacare is going to remain. I mean, if Romney had come in, obviously he would have tried to slowly dismantle it. Obviously, businesses large and small are now going to deal with it, whether they like it or not. Some like it, some don't. I think on Wall Street, you have a sense of, we know he's going to keep the Federal Reserve intact. We know that he's going to keep a lot of his regulations intact, et cetera. Again, whether you like him or you don't, at least it's a certainty. The economy shows signs of improving slowly but surely. Businesses are obviously going to want to see much more of that, but it's more of the same, I think.
The last thing I would ever do is put you on the spot, but when the market opens tomorrow, stocks up or down?
I think you're going to see the market rally, at least initially. Obviously, you have, you know, slightly more than half the country that's Democratic. I think you're going to see a sigh of relief in that sense. But pretty quickly, I think you're going to start to look at the problems. The next obstacle, if you will, the next thing that's looming over us is the so-called fiscal cliff, which is this this sort of patchwork agreement a couple of years ago with the Bush tax cuts and regulations and so forth. And you're going to have Democrats and Republicans come together. They're not known for coming together to solve this. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of tax increases that will hit January 1st that virtually everyone agrees would be negative for the economy. So there's not going to be a long honeymoon.
If at all, enjoy it while you can. Walter Hamilton is a financial reporter here at the LA Times. Thanks, Walter.
Thanks, David.
I'm here with Scott Kraft, Deputy Managing Editor for A1. Scott, thanks for joining us. Good to be here. So the news has been announced. President Obama is going to be in office for another 4 years. How do you decide how do you work through the process of deciding what to run in tomorrow's paper?
Well, actually, that process begins weeks ago when we try to decide what we're going to be running, on the morning of the election, the morning after the election. Obviously, we don't know who's going to win, so we set up with a certain number of stories that we're pretty sure we're going to use, like the main story on whoever wins.
So you come up with templates for both.
Exactly, and we have had a layout earlier today for whoever won. It'd obviously be a big story for us. We have about 4 stories on the front page for tomorrow. We're not sure exactly what they'll be at this hour. Certainly one story will be about the presidential race. Another story will be an analysis of what went on and what that means for the future. And then a third story will be a California story, which is very important here.
And how do you sort of move the story forward? This is a newspaper, the news is out there already on TV, social media, and all that.
It is. Well, in fact, certainly we have the results of the presidential election at this point, but we don't really know what's happening in California. And there are very many, or a handful of very important propositions that still have to be decided. We don't even know if we'll get those results tonight. We hope so, but if we don't, we'll certainly have to have follow-up stories tomorrow on what those mean, what those results are, and what those mean.
And, this was called sort of early, which was nice and surprising. Previous elections that you've worked on, can you talk about the experiences and sort of compare and contrast in terms of a timeline?
Well, of course, 2000 was the worst, or the best, depending on your point of view. We were sitting in this newsroom about 3 a.m. that night, dispatching people to Florida. So we're not doing that tonight, and we're pretty happy about that, actually. That makes for a very difficult evening, especially when you don't really know whether you can call the election or not. At this point, we can obviously call the presidential election. But as I say, the California results are, still coming in, and we're not really sure what'll happen there. And tomorrow morning's paper might not have full results on those.
Sure, and then if we do get the results for California, do you guys, again, as with the presidential election, have sort of a dual layout?
We do. Well, we have a spot on the page for 1 or 2 stories from California. One key will be the propositions. Another thing we're looking at very closely is what happens in the Assembly and in the Senate. And if we have a supermajority, a Democratic supermajority in either of those houses or both of those houses, that's a big story for us. So that could well go on the front page.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Scott. We're going to head back to David Lazarus.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Very interesting look at how the newspaper comes together. If you're just joining us, if you've had your head in the sand for a little while now, well, it's all done but the shouting. President Obama is being called the winner of this contest after virtually everyone, but not everyone, has said that Ohio has gone his way. Who isn't saying that the president has taken Ohio?
Well, I was just watching Fox News, and they had made the call, their election desk, their analysis desk had made the call, Ohio to President Obama, therefore the whole ball of wax, the whole contest to President Obama. They then went to someone, Karl Rove, who our viewers are familiar with. Karl Rove, who after all went through the 2000 election with George Bush, where Florida was famously called for Al Gore, then it was uncalled, and of course George Bush went on to win by 527 votes. So Karl Rove kind of put his foot down, and now right now, I can't be watching it this second, but Fox News is in the process of revisiting this whole question, apparently have brought on some of their own analysis team and are going to go, I don't know, vote by vote, county by county, precinct by precinct, and see if they can uncall Ohio, I guess. I don't know. I've never seen anything quite like this before.
Well, that's about as fair and balanced as it gets, I guess.
It's a little different because usually you've got the people who make these calls for you who are professional pollsters, analysts, and you usually don't make a call and then pull back from it. It's not unprecedented. As I said, in 2000, we had some mistaken calls. Since 2000, the networks and the cable outlets have tried to be a lot more careful about making the calls. So for the record, I mean, CNN, AP, all the networks have all called the race in Ohio and therefore the presidency for Obama, but Fox has pulled back a little bit. And there's pushback from other people, too, who aren't quite happy with the outcome.
All right, and if you're watching, you can see a feed here from ABC News, some partying going on. This looks like this is in Chicago, where undoubtedly the president is going to give a speech of some sort because he has been watching the returns from his home base in Chicago. So this is probably anticipatory of that, and looks like a fairly excited crowd about that. If there is a concession speech from the Romney camp or from the candidate himself, we will carry that. There hasn't been any word yet from the Romney camp about this, nor has Mitt Romney or anyone else who speaks for him sent out any tweets, which is interesting. I think, like Fox, they are playing it safe. They want to basically see the paint dry on the wall before they step up and say, no, it's not ours.
Right, and if you can, I think people could be a little bit sympathetic with this man's been running for president for 6 years, counting his last run. He's put millions and $1 billion really into this. He doesn't want to concede too early. He wants to make sure it's the real thing. They might be putting the finishing touches. He claimed anyway, as of very recently, that he didn't have a concession speech. So if that's true, it's a little hard to believe. But
in fact, he actually said that he had written his victory speech.
He had written his victory speech, so he may be trying to whip together some sort of commentary.
There's one thing, Jim, and that is just a few weeks ago, Ann Romney came out and said, if Mitt loses, big if in her mind, he will not run again. That, according to Ann Romney, is that so? I mean, I think once these guys get it in their blood, it's very hard for them to walk away. And I think Mitt Romney still considers himself to be in his prime.
Yeah, well, it's going to be a little hard for him, though, because he is now, take this with a grain of salt, but he's a two-time loser. I mean, he didn't win 4 years ago. He now didn't win this time. I think the Republican Party is really going to have to examine itself and decide which way to go. This is another moderate candidate. There's going to be a huge fight inside the party. A lot of the partisans, a lot of the Tea Party people, the sort of true believers, are going to argue we've got to put in a more dogmatic, a more partisan sort of candidate, and that's going to be a big fight.
So let's ask the question then, how smart was Paul Ryan? Did he play this just right to elevate himself to the national level and to be seen as the ideological heir of the Republican Party, or in some way does he look like damaged goods as well?
Well, I think Paul Ryan certainly is going to position himself to try and run 4 years from now. There's no doubt. He's very ambitious. He would be one of the preferred candidates to the true believers, the right wing of the Republican Party, and not just the right wing, but the ideological conservatives, the purists. Then there are going to be candidates, maybe Tim Pawlenty's going to make a comeback. We're going to see some of these more centrist candidates, and there will be a huge fight within the party. Some people you're going to have Marco Rubio running, I'm sure, 4 years from now.
Chris Christie?
Chris Christie may be in there. And these would be Chris Christie, who famously in the last week seemed to almost come out for President Obama.
Pretty darn close.
Yeah, almost did. And he was asked to go to a rally in the last few days in Philadelphia with Mitt Romney and said, I'm a little bit busy. So this is going to be a very sharp divide in the Republican Party.
Now here's a question. How does this all play out for the Tea Party? This was supposed to be the Tea Party coming of age and flexing its muscles. Paul Ryan was their guy. If the Tea Party couldn't pull this out, does this mean that the Tea Party then becomes marginalized and perhaps the Republican Party can move to a more moderate position, a less right-wing extremist position, and actually, in the eyes of many, get themselves back in the game?
Well, that's going to be the argument from some part of the party, but there certainly is a lot of oomph still in this Tea Party movement. And what they're going to say is, look, we didn't go pure enough. Yeah, you had Paul Ryan in there. He should have been the presidential nominee. He was too watered down by Mitt Romney. If we can get someone like him in the number one position in the ticket, we're going to win. Now, a lot of people don't believe that. They see the demographic. In fact, you heard quite controversial talk tonight from Bill O'Reilly on Fox News, who's talking about the changing nature of the country. He said, in fact, I'm reading here, the white establishment is now the minority, he said, and the voters, many of them, feel that the economic system is stacked against them and they want stuff. They want stuff. And he's talking about people of color, minorities who want stuff. It sounds a lot like the 47% remark. And, this is opening a whole can of worms. There's a lot of people in the Republican Party who think that kind of talk is only going to drive them further away from a national election victory.
And what about Donald Trump? What did he have to say?
Donald Trump, I had to write these down because the Donald is at it again. He tweeted out a couple fascinating things right here when the election went the wrong way for him, when Romney apparently lost. He said, the phony Electoral College made a laughingstock out of our nation. The loser won. The loser won, and he spelled won, O-N-E. I think he meant W-O-N, but anyway. And then he said, we can't let this happen. We should march on Washington and stop this travesty. Our nation is totally divided. And there's exclamation points.
The man, the myth, the legend.
So there you have it.
We just found out that President Obama is on his way to the Illinois Convention Center, where you're looking at live footage right now. Clearly, the president is gearing up for what's going to be obviously a victory speech after virtually everyone has called the election for him except Fox News, which is kind of still thinking things over a little bit, as is their wont. But considering that the rest of the world seems to think that President Obama has now 4 more years in office, I think the president is feeling fairly confident that he can now step up, and clearly this crowd that we're looking at here, thanks to this feed from ABC News, is ebullient, they are joyous, and they are very excited about having the president, not the president-elect, but the president to stay, coming back and, well, not giving an entire outline of his agenda for the next 4 years, but probably hitting the key bullet points. And that is, we're on the right track, I think he'll say, and there's more work to be done.
Right. I talked to one of Obama's top advisors in the last few days, and he said one thing that a lot of people didn't pick up on, which was he wasn't feeling that defensive about the economy. He knows it's bad, he knows it needs to get better, but they felt there'd been an uptick in several of the indices. Unemployment, not great, but hadn't gotten worse. Gas prices had come down, consumer spending was up, home sales are improving. There are a lot of indicators that are at least ticking in the right direction, and they feel like their whole argument was, let's keep this going, let's not go back.
Well, Jim, one thing that's surprised me consistently as a business writer is I look at the data that's coming out and I see the trend lines that are out there, and it's clear that we are in a recovery. Now, not a fast recovery, to be sure, and it would be great if there was more hiring going on, more people getting jobs, the housing market stabilizing faster. All that would be good, but it is clear where the trend line is, and that was what the president has been saying consistently is, look at what I've done. I have laid the groundwork for this. Moreover, I have forestalled complete disaster, which is a hard thing to run on. I mean, you can't say, well, it could have been worse. But I think most prognosticators out there said that it would have been a lot worse had some of the measures that have been put in place, the bailout of Detroit, for example, the TARP program, other such things that put money into the economy at a time when the private sector was not doing it. Well, I think the president is now able to say, it worked, and it helped out, and that's what we're going to build on now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a good percentage of the country that does believe that they wanted Obama to do better. They wanted lower unemployment. Of course, we all want that. But they did look at the things he'd done. In particular, I've got to say the auto bailout, which Mitt Romney famously argued against, wrote a Wall Street Journal editorial.
Let it go bankrupt.
We let it go bankrupt. With that headline alone, believe me, cost him who knows how many votes in Ohio, which it now looks like he's lost, and
also
lost the presidency.
Michigan.
Yeah, and Michigan. You could argue a lot of those states in that area. So that really was a big problem for Mitt Romney, is people did believe that some of the measures the president took were very helpful, and the argument that government should be totally removed in all cases, I think flies with a lot of the electorate, but it doesn't fly apparently with a majority, and that's why you see Barack Obama about to accept his second term in office.
Indeed, that's what we're looking at here. Live footage from ABC News. It's the Convention Center in Chicago, where the president has been following all of this. We'll carry that when it happens. And after we take a quick breather here, we'll be back not just with post-game on the President's Day, but also all of the returns from California. Yes, there was an election here in California as well. And yes, there's a lot of very important things still to be decided. I'm David Lazarus. Jim Rainey, thank you very much. Stick around, because live coverage from the LA Times newsroom will continue in just a moment.